Silas Varden didn't knock. He never knocked. He pushed open the gate like he owned it, walked straight up to where Eliza was crouching in the dirt between the potato rows, and stood there with his thumbs in his belt loops, looking down at her the way a man looks at something stuck to the bottom of his boot. "That your idea?" he said, nodding toward the crooked willow maze her husband had spent 4 days building. "Those little lanes for your, what are they, pets?" Eliza looked up at him. She didn't answer right away. Silas made a sound in the back of his throat, not quite a laugh, something worse than that, more like a verdict. 63 blind ducks, and a woman who thinks she's smarter than 40 years of farming. He said it loud enough that 2 men standing by the fence could hear. "You're going to lose that crop, girl. And when you do, don't come looking for charity from this valley." He turned and walked away without waiting for her to speak. And the 2 men at the fence laughed. If you have ever had someone look at you like that, like everything you believed about yourself was a joke, then you already understand what happened next. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, consider subscribing and following this story all the way to the end. You won't want to miss what's coming. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me the city or country where you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Briar Hollow, because what Eliza Rourke did next is something nobody in that valley ever forgot. The morning Eliza Rourke first walked the 40 acres that would either save them or ruin them, she did it alone. Caleb had gone to town before sunup to settle an argument with the feed merchant over a debt that was already 3 weeks overdue. He'd kissed her on the forehead and said don't worry the same way he always did when he was worried himself, and she'd watched him ride out into the gray light without saying anything back. She pulled on her boots. One had a crack along the heel that let the mud in when the ground was wet, and walked out into the field. It was early April. The potato plants had been in the ground for 6 weeks. They came up thin and pale at first, the way they always did, but by now the rows were showing real green, real promise. Eliza moved slowly between them, not because she had to, but because she always moved that way through growing things. Like she was listening. Most people who met Eliza Rourke made up their minds about her within about 30 seconds. She was a large woman, heavy through the hips and the shoulders, and she moved with the kind of deliberate weight that some people mistook for slowness. She was 24 years old. She had a broad, quiet face and dark eyes that didn't blink as often as most people's, which made some folks uneasy without knowing exactly why. What those people didn't see, what they never bothered to look for, was what happened behind those eyes. Eliza noticed things. Not in the way people say she notices things, meaning she remembered names or caught spelling errors. She noticed the way the ground itself behaved. She could walk a field and feel which sections drained too fast and which held water too long just from how the soil gave under her boots. She watched insects the way other women watched the road into town for visitors, tracking which ones moved and which ones stayed still and what that meant for tomorrow's weather. She taught herself, slowly and without any formal instruction, to read what the land was trying to say. Caleb knew this about her. It was, if she was being honest, one of the main reasons she'd said yes when he asked her. That and the way he listened. She was on her 3rd pass through the field that morning when she stopped. She crouched down and yes, it was an effort. It always was. Her knees aching and her weight shifting one foot forward onto her hands to balance and turned over a single potato leaf. The underside was clustered with small orange dots. Organized. Deliberate. Maybe 40 eggs, maybe more, packed together in tight rows like something had planned them. She turned over the next leaf, more eggs. The leaf after that, more. Eliza sat back on her heels in the dirt and stared at the row ahead of her, and she did the math in her head without wanting to. 40 eggs per cluster. Clusters on maybe 1 in 6 leaves right now. But these were Colorado potato beetles. She'd seen the aftermath of an infestation 2 valleys over, heard the stories from people who'd lost entire seasons in under 3 weeks. The larvae hatched fast. They ate faster. And once the population tipped past a certain point, there was no catching it by hand. You simply lost. She pressed her palm flat against the dirt, just to feel something solid. Then she stood up, brushed the mud from her knees, and walked back to the house. She didn't panic. That's the thing about Eliza that the neighbors never understood, even later when they were forced to understand everything else about her. She didn't panic, because panic, in her experience, was just the brain's way of refusing to work. She'd learned that early, growing up in a house with a father who came home different, depending on what the season had done to him, and a mother who managed by staying very quiet and very steady, no matter what was falling apart. Eliza had inherited the steadiness. She hadn't always been grateful for it. Sometimes she wanted to cry or shout or throw something, but she'd learned to use it. She sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and began writing down everything she knew about Colorado potato beetles, their life cycle, their vulnerabilities, their patterns. She was still sitting there when Caleb came home. He looked at her face when he walked in, then at the paper, and said, "What happened?" "Eggs," she said, "all through the east section. Probably the west by now, too." Caleb pulled out the chair across from her and sat down heavy. He took off his hat and set it on the table between them. He was a lean man, Caleb, with reddish hair that was already thinning at 27 and hands that seemed too large for his arms. He had a good face, an honest face, but right now it had gone the color of old paper. "How," he said. "Bad enough," Eliza said. "If they hatch and we don't get ahead of them, we lose the crop." The silence that followed lasted maybe 10 seconds, but felt longer than that. "We lose the crop," Caleb repeated slowly, like he was translating from another language, because he understood what that meant. It wasn't just the potatoes. The potatoes were their debt payment. The potatoes were the mortgage extension. Most of its windows were dark. The potatoes were the reason the bank hadn't already sent someone out to walk the property with a clipboard and a disinterested expression. "We could handpick," he said, "the larvae when they hatch. There are too many plants," Eliza said, "and it'll be fast. We'd need more hands than we have. I can ask around." "See, and pay them with what?" He stopped. She wasn't trying to be cruel. That was just the number sitting in front of them, the same way the eggs were sitting under the leaves. Facts didn't get kinder just because you wanted them to. Caleb stared at his hat on the table for a moment, then looked up. "So what do we do?" Eliza told him about the notice she'd seen tacked to the post at the general store 3 days ago. A breeder on the far side of the valley, Hector Pruitt, was selling off his entire duck, flock 63 birds, for almost nothing. The reason nobody had taken them was the reason he was practically giving them away. The flock had developed a hereditary condition. Most of them had severely impaired vision. A few were nearly fully blind. Pruitt was cutting his losses. Caleb stared at her. "You want to buy blind ducks?" "I want to buy 63 animals who eat insects," Eliza said, "and who can't run away fast because they can't see where they're going." "Eliza, beetles live in the rows," she said, "low to the ground near the plants. If we keep the ducks in the rows, they'll eat the larvae when they hatch, before the larvae can climb." Caleb opened his mouth, closed it, then said, "The rows are too wide. The ducks will scatter." "Not if the rows aren't wide," she said. She turned the paper over and began to draw. It took her about 4 minutes to sketch the basic structure. Narrow corridors, maybe 18 inches across, running between the potato plants. Low walls made from scraps, barrel staves, anything they had lying around that could be repurposed. The corridors would keep the ducks channeled directly over the ground where the beetles would emerge. Most of its windows were dark. The birds couldn't see well enough to navigate open ground with any confidence, but inside a narrow lane with walls on both sides, they'd move forward. They'd eat what was in front of them. Caleb looked at the drawing for a long time without speaking. "It might work," he finally said. "It'll work," Eliza said, and then caught herself, because she wasn't certain. She was gambling, and she knew it. "I think it'll work," she corrected. There was a difference, and she respected the difference. The cost of buying the flock would clean out their small reserve, the money they'd been holding back, for exactly the kind of emergency that couldn't be predicted. Most of its windows were dark. Spending it on 63 half-blind ducks was either the most practical decision they could make or the fastest way to guarantee they lost everything. "If it doesn't work," Caleb said. "If it doesn't work, we were probably losing the crop anyway," Eliza said. "At least this way we tried something." He looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his eyes she recognized, not doubt in her exactly, but the weight of what he was being asked to trust. She'd asked him to trust her before, on smaller things, and she'd been right more often than not. But this was not a small thing. "All right," he said. They rode out to Pruitt's place the next morning. Hector Pruitt was a short, sunburned man who looked like he'd been disappointed by something every day of his adult life, and had made peace with it. He watched Eliza and Caleb climb down from the wagon, with the expression of a man who has learned not to expect much from Tuesday either. "You're the ones inquiring about the ducks," he said. "We are," Caleb said. Pruitt looked at Eliza, then looked away in that particular manner some men had not rued exactly, just the look of a man filing her in a category without meaning to. She was used to it. She watched the ducks instead. They were in a large pen near the back of the property, and the first thing she noticed was that they moved differently from healthy ducks. They didn't spread out and explore the way birds with full vision did. They clustered. They moved in short, uncertain lines, following the sound of each other rather than anything they could see. When one of them hit the fence rail, it didn't panic, it just adjusted, turned a few degrees, and kept moving. "They're calm," she said. "Calm's one word," Pruitt said. "Dull's another. How's their appetite?" He looked at her properly then. "Fine, better than fine, actually. They eat more than sighted birds, I think, because they're not wasting energy on looking around all the time." Eliza nodded. That made sense to her. She crouched down at the fence and watched a particular bird, a large one, with a patch of darker feathers behind its right eye, tap its bill along the ground in a methodical sweep. Left, right, looking with its mouth instead of its eyes. "We'll take them," she said. Pruitt sold all 63 for a price that made Caleb wince quietly, and Eliza could feel the exact moment the last of their reserve money changed hands. It felt like stepping off a ledge. Not falling, not yet. Just the air under her feet instead of the ground. They loaded the birds into 3 crates and drove home slowly, and she listened to their sounds in the back of the wagon, low, unconcerned murmuring, and told herself she hadn't made a mistake. She told herself that 3 or 4 times. When they got back to Briar Hollow, the first person they saw was Silas Varden. He was standing at his own fence line, watching them pull up, and he walked over with his hands in his pockets, and the measured pace of a man who has nowhere urgent to be because he doesn't allow urgency in his life. Silas Varden was 61 years old and had been farming this valley for 35 of those years. He was not a cruel man, exactly. He was the kind of man who had been right about enough things over enough years that being right had become part of his identity, and anything that threatened his rightness felt, to him, like a personal attack. His farm was the largest in Briar Hollow. His opinions arrived before he did. When Silas Varden made up his mind, the valley generally went along with it. He looked at the crates in the back of the wagon. He looked at Eliza. "Pruitt's birds," he said. "That's right," Caleb said. "Blind ones, most of them." Silas let that sit for a moment. "You got beetle eggs." "Some," Caleb said, which was technically true the way saying it's raining a little during a flood is technically true. "Copper spray," Silas said. "That's the answer. Been the answer for 20 years. You coat the leaves, the larvae don't survive contact. I've beaten beetles 4 out of 5 seasons with copper spray." "We don't have the money for copper spray," Eliza said. Silas glanced at her, then back at Caleb. It was a small thing, that glance, but she noticed it. She always noticed it. "Then you borrow it," Silas said. "From the bank, from neighbors." "You don't—" He stopped, looked at the crates again. Made that sound, the one she described earlier, the verdict in the throat. "You don't buy 63 blind ducks and put them in your potato rows." "We're not putting them in the rows yet," Eliza said. "We need to train them first." "Train them," Silas repeated. "To follow a whistle. To stay in lanes." To Miss Rourke, he used her unmarried name, whether from habit or intention she couldn't tell. "I have been farming this valley since before you were born. I have seen people try clever things with beetles. Every single one of them lost their crop." He paused. "Every single one." "How many of them tried ducks?" she asked. The question hung there. Silas looked at her for a moment, with an expression she couldn't quite read: irritation, maybe, or something close to it, with a thin layer of something else underneath that she didn't have a name for yet. He turned and walked away. And standing at the fence, watching him go, Eliza felt the weight of the money she'd spent and the eggs still multiplying under her potato leaves and the 63 half-blind birds murmuring in their crates. And she thought, "I am either very smart or very stupid right now, and I will know which one in about 10 days. She started training the ducks the next morning, before the sun was fully up. It was harder than she'd imagined, and she had imagined it being hard. The birds had no reference points, no sense of a space they trusted. They clustered together out of anxiety as much as habit. Getting them to follow any individual signal, a whistle, a movement, A sound meant first convincing each bird individually that the signal was worth following. And doing that meant hours. Hours of patient crouching, hours of placing grain and water in specific patterns, hours of the same pulse whistle note repeated until her lips were cracked and her lower back had locked into a dull grinding ache that she refused to pay attention to. Caleb built the corridor system while she trained. He was good with his hands, careful and methodical, and he'd taken her sketch and turned it into something real using scrap boards and the barrel hoops from 3 old casks and woven willow branches he cut from along the creek. He worked from early morning until the light failed, and she could hear him out in the field when she was at the pen, and sometimes she'd look up and find him watching her from 50 yards away, with an expression she couldn't interpret from that distance. On the 3rd day, she got a breakthrough. She was kneeling at the edge of the pen, completely exhausted, her skirt soaked through with mud from the knee down, when she tried the whistle for what felt like the 100th time 2 short notes, low then high, and the duck with the dark patch behind its right eye turned directly toward her. Not just toward the sound, toward her. It took 3 steps in her direction. Eliza held perfectly still and made the sound again. The duck came another 2 steps. She laid a handful of grain on the ground directly in front of her. The bird found it with that sideways bill sweep she'd been watching for days, and while it ate, she laid another handful 6 inches further along, and then another, and before she understood what was happening, she had the duck following a trail of grain the full length of the pen. And when she whistled at the far end, it lifted its head and came toward the sound without the grain being there at all. It had learned the whistle. Eliza sat back against the pen post and felt something let go in her chest. Not triumph, it was too early for triumph, and she was too tired for it. But something. A door opening where she hadn't been sure there was a door. She was so focused on the duck that she didn't notice Vera Hollis, and her daughter standing at the fence behind her, and Vera said, "Good Lord, what are you doing with those things?" Eliza stood, brushed the mud from her hands. "Teaching them," she said. Vera Hollis was a well-meaning woman who expressed her goodwill primarily through worry. She had a sharp face and sharp opinions, and she loved her neighbors, the way some people love an argument constantly, and with great energy. "Eliza, honey, those birds can barely see. You're wasting your time. Then, lower, you're also wasting whatever money you paid for them. But I suppose that ship has sailed." "They don't need to see," Eliza said. "They need to hear." Vera's daughter, she was maybe 14. A serious girl named Ruth, who was quieter than her mother by about 40 decibels, was watching the duck with the dark patch with an expression of frank scientific curiosity. "It followed the whistle," Ruth said. "Yes," Eliza said, "even when there wasn't food at the end." "Yes." Ruth nodded slowly. "That's actually interesting," she said. Vera took her daughter firmly by the arm and guided her away from the fence, with the expression of a woman removing a child from a dangerous influence. Eliza watched them go, and she heard Vera say something. As they walked away, she caught only the word husband and the word sense, and she turned back to her ducks before the rest of it could reach her. By the end of the first week, 9 of the 63 ducks reliably responded to the whistle. 9. She needed them all. The eggs were still hatching. She knew because she walked the field every evening and checked, and every evening there were more larvae than the evening before. They were still in the early stage, still small and slow, but the timeline was compressing. She had 10 days, maybe 12 at the outside, before the beetle population would pass the point where even a perfect system could contain it. Caleb knew this too. He didn't say it directly, that wasn't his way, but she could feel it in how he moved around her. Careful, like someone navigating a room where the floor might not hold. On the 8th night of training, she was coming in from the pen, after dark, when she heard riders on the road. She stopped and listened. 3 horses, maybe 4, moving at a walking pace, and voices, men's voices, the kind that carry the specific texture of having been lubricated with something from a bottle. She caught fragments. Caleb's name, Circus. That word repeated with laughter around it. She stood very still, in the dark, outside her own front door, and listened to men she had probably known for years laugh about her ducks and her corridors, and the large woman who thought she knew better than the valley did. And here is the thing that she never told anyone, not even Caleb. It didn't make her angry. It made her tired. Not the kind of tired that makes you stop. The other kind. The kind that calcifies into something harder and quieter and much more durable than anger. She went inside. She ate cold supper standing at the counter. She went to bed, and she was up before dawn. The ninth duck learned the whistle on a Tuesday. Most of its windows were dark. Eliza knew it was Tuesday because Caleb had gone to the post office the day before on Monday and come back with a letter from the bank that neither of them had spoken about since, though she'd seen him fold it and put it in the tin box under the floorboard where they kept documents they weren't ready to deal with yet. Most of its windows were dark. The letter sat there in the dark under their feet all night, and neither of them mentioned it at breakfast, which told her everything she needed to know about how serious it was. So it was Tuesday, and the ninth duck learned the whistle, and she wrote the number down in her little book. The same way she wrote everything down plain and factual, without celebration, because 9 was still not 63, and she didn't have the luxury of celebrating fractions. The corridor system was finished by that point. Caleb had completed the last section the previous Friday, hammering the final willow stakes into the ground with a kind of grim, focused energy that meant he was worried and managing it through work. She'd walked the whole thing that evening after supper, moving slowly through the narrow lanes he'd built between the potato rows 18 inches across, just as she'd designed, with low walls of scrapboard and woven willow on either side, rising maybe 10 inches off the ground. Enough to confuse a bird that couldn't see well, enough to keep them moving forward instead of scattering. It wasn't pretty. None of it was. The boards were mismatched widths, some weathered gray, some still showing the original pale wood. The barrel hoops holding certain sections together were rusting at the joints. The willow weaving was tight in some places and loose in others, depending on how tired Caleb had been when he got to that section. But it was solid. She'd pushed against the walls with her hands, and they'd held, and that was what mattered. What she hadn't anticipated was what it looked like from the road. Silas Vardzin saw it on the Saturday morning. She didn't know he was there until she heard the voice. She was in the pen working with the ducks, her back to the road, and she heard him say something she couldn't quite catch, followed by another voice. She thought it was Tom Alderley, who farmed the quarter section on the other side of Silas, and then laughter. Not the private, low laughter of men sharing something between themselves. The outdoor kind. The kind that wants to be heard. She kept working. What she was doing at that moment was teaching the flock to follow each other. She discovered, almost by accident, that the ducks responded not just to her whistle, but to the movement of the one bird they'd learned to track. By sound, the dark-patched one she'd started privately calling Scout, though she never said the name out loud, because she'd learned early that naming things made their loss harder, and she couldn't afford harder. When Scout moved toward the whistle sole, 3 or 4 others followed, simply because they heard the movement and trusted it. And when those 4 moved, others followed them. It was, she realized, less about training 63 individual birds and more about training a handful of leaders and letting the rest follow instinct. This was the insight she'd been working toward for 11 days without quite seeing it, and it arrived that Saturday morning in the middle of Silas Vardin's laughter, which struck her later as exactly the kind of thing life did when it was in a particular mood. She stood up and turned around. There were 4 of them at the fence, Silas and Tom Alderley, and 2 other men she recognized but didn't know well, brothers from further down the valley. Large men with the same jaw structure and the same unhurried way of taking up space. They were all looking at the corridor system. Tom Alderley had his hand over his mouth, but she could see his shoulders moving. Silas wasn't hiding it. He was looking at the willow maze with an expression of frank amusement, head tilted slightly, the way you look at something that confirms what you already thought. "It's a circus," he said. Not to her, to Tom, to the brothers. The woman built a circus in her potato field. Tom Alderley lowered his hand. "What's it supposed to do?" "Keep the ducks in the rows," Silas said, "so they eat the beetles." He said it flatly, as a summary, in the way that makes something sound obviously foolish, without requiring a single word of direct criticism. One of the brothers said something she didn't catch, and the other one laughed loudly. Eliza walked to the fence. She didn't hurry. She made herself not hurry, because hurrying would have looked like what it was. "Silas," she said. He looked at her. "Morning, Miss Rourke." Still the unmarried name. She'd decided by now it was habit. She let it be habit. "How are your fields looking?" she asked. A fraction of a pause. "Find any eggs?" "Nothing I can't manage." "Copper spray," she said. "That's right." She nodded. Looked at the brothers, then back at Silas. I hope it works, she said, and meant it. And then she turned and walked back to her ducks without giving him the chance to respond. She heard Tom Alderley say something quietly as she walked away. She heard Silas say, "Give it a week." She kept walking. Caleb had heard the exchange from the far end of the field where he'd been checking the corridor joints. He came up to her when the men at the fence had moved on, and he had that look he sometimes got where he was constructing something to say and wasn't sure yet if he'd say it. "They're going to keep doing that," he said finally. "Yes," she agreed. "It bothers you." She thought about that honestly. "Yes," she said again, "but not enough to stop." He looked at her for a moment, and something passed across his face, not admiration exactly, or not only that, more like the recognition of something in her, that he was still, after 2 years of marriage, in the process of fully understanding. He nodded once and went back to his joints. She went back to her ducks. By the end of that second week, 31 birds responded consistently to the whistle. 31 out of 63, which was just barely a majority, and majority wasn't enough. But the dynamic she'd identified with Scout was accelerating things. The 4 birds that followed Scout squirts were themselves being followed by 8 or 9 others, and those 8 or 9 were pulling others along in their wake. The flock was developing an internal momentum she hadn't designed and hadn't predicted, and she found herself spending less time training individual birds, and more time simply reinforcing the whistle association at the head of the group and letting the social structure of the flock do the rest, the work. It was slower than she wanted. Everything was slower than she wanted. On the 14th day after she'd found the first eggs, she walked the field at dusk and counted larvae. They were everywhere now. Not the early stage ones she'd been watching. These were second and third instar, fatter and darker and more aggressive feeders. They were climbing. Some of them had made it to the middle sections of the plants. The lowest leaves on 3 rows in the east section were already showing the lace pattern damage that meant feeding had been underway long enough to matter. She stood in the row and looked at the damage and counted forward in her head. If the beetles reached full instar and began laying their own eggs before she got the ducks in the field, the population would compound faster than 63 birds could possibly manage. She needed the ducks working within 4 days, maybe 5, at the absolute outside. She had 31 reliable birds. She went home and told Caleb. He was eating supper. She'd left a plate for him, cold bean soup and cornbread that had dried out a little at the edge, and he listened to her without interrupting, which was one of the things she valued most about him. When she'd finished, he set his spoon down and sat back and said, "So we go with 31. "It's not enough," she said. "Can we herd the others? Even if they don't follow the whistle, if we just physically move them, they'll panic and scatter. Blind animals that panic in an open space will spend more time chasing them than they'll spend eating." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "How many more days do you need?" "I don't have more days," she said. "I have 4. He got up from the table and went to the window and looked out at the dark field. She watched his back. His shoulders had a particular set when he was doing calculations he didn't like the answer to, and they had that set now. "Then we work with what we have," he said. "Caleb, we go with 31, and we do the best we can." And he stopped. Started again. "What else is there, Eliza? Tell me what else there is." She didn't answer because there wasn't an answer. He was right, which was sometimes the hardest thing about him. 4 more days of training, she said, and then we put them in. 4 days, he agreed. She trained from before sunrise until she couldn't see her hand in front of her face. She skipped meals or ate while walking. Her lower back developed a permanent ache that spread into her hips by the 3rd day, and her lips cracked so badly from the constant whistling that one corner split and bled when she opened her mouth too wide, which she ignored because there was no time not to ignore it. On the 2nd of the 4 remaining days, Ruth Hollis came back. She came alone this time without her mother, which meant she'd either gotten permission by not asking or by asking someone other than Vera. She stood at the fence with her arms folded on the top rail and watched Eliza work with the same focused, unself-conscious attention she'd shown the first time. After about 20 minutes, she said, "Can I come in?" Eliza looked at her. 14, maybe 15 years old. Serious eyes. Clean hands that suggested she'd done fewer outdoor chores than most valley girls her age, which matched what Eliza knew about Vera Hollis's ideas about propriety. "Your mother know you're here?" Eliza said. She knows I went for a walk, Ruth said. Eliza almost smiled. Come in then. Ruth climbed the fence rail in a manner that suggested she'd been climbing fence rails her whole life, despite her mother's probable objections, and she came and crouched beside Eliza with the natural ease of a person who has no awareness of their own body as something requiring management. What are you doing right now? Ruth asked. Teaching the ones that don't follow Scout to follow the ones that do. Scout's the one with the dark patch? Eliza looked at her. I didn't say that name out loud. Ruth shrugged. You look at that one differently than the others. I figured you'd named it. She paused. How do you teach them to follow the followers? Eliza showed her. It took about 10 minutes to demonstrate the grain trail method, the whistle timing, the way she positioned herself to create a channel that pointed the uncertain birds toward the reliable ones. Ruth watched without interrupting, and then when Eliza finished, she said, Can I try? Eliza handed her the grain pouch without hesitation. Ruth tried. She was clumsy at first. Her whistle was the wrong pitch, and two of the birds she was trying to redirect went in the wrong direction entirely and had to be gently herded back, but she didn't get flustered. She adjusted her approach without being told to. She tried a slightly different pitch, watched the response, adjusted again. By the fourth or fifth attempt, she had a small group of 4 birds moving reasonably well in the direction she wanted. Huh, Ruth said. What? Eliza said. It's not that different from working the sheep my uncle keeps, Ruth said. You're not telling them what to do. You're just making one option easier than the others. Eliza looked at her for a moment. That's exactly it, she said. Ruth came back the next morning, and the morning after that, and she was careful each time to arrive before the road got busy with regular farm traffic, which Eliza understood was the girl's way of managing the problem of her mother. She didn't ask about it. She put Ruth to work, and Ruth worked without complaint. And by the 4th morning, the last morning, before Eliza had promised Caleb they'd put the birds into the field, they had 54 of the 63 ducks responding reliably to the whistle. 54, not 63, but 54. Eliza stood in the pen that last morning looking at the flock, and she felt something she hadn't let herself feel yet, a careful, provisional, still frightened version of hope. Not the bright kind. The kind that knows better than to get too comfortable. Ruth was standing beside her. Is it enough? Ruth asked. I don't know, Eliza said, but we're going to find out today. Ruth nodded. Then she said, My mother says you're going to lose the farm. I know what your mother says. I don't think she's right, Ruth said. Eliza looked at the girl. There was something in Ruth's face that she recognized, not the certainty of someone who doesn't understand risk, but the deliberate choice of someone who does understand it and has decided to stand somewhere anyway. Go home before your mother worries, Eliza said. Ruth climbed the fence and walked away across the field, and Eliza watched her go, and then she picked up her grain pouch and her willow switch, and she whistled 2 notes, low then high, and the flock moved toward her in their awkward earnest, half-blind way, and she felt the specific kind of love that is really just the recognition of effort in another creature that cannot speak. She did not say this out loud either. The first morning with the ducks in the corridors was a disaster. Not a total disaster. Not the kind that ends things. But the kind that makes you understand how much you didn't know when you thought you knew enough. The problem was the noise. When Caleb opened the pen gate and Eliza whistled, and the first group of birds moved into the corridor entrance, everything seemed to be working. Scout went first as she'd hoped. The core group followed. The secondary group followed the core. And then a duck near the back of the flock, one of the ones that had only been moderately reliable in training, got spooked by the sudden confinement of the corridor walls and made a sound, a sharp, alarmed sound, and that sound went through the flock like electricity. 30 birds froze. 12 went backward. 4 somehow managed to go sideways through a gap in the willow weaving that Caleb had thought was tight enough. Eliza stood in the middle of the resulting chaos and made herself breathe. Get the 4, she said to Caleb. Her voice came out flat and steady, which surprised her a little. Caleb was already moving. He was good in a crisis, not fast exactly, purposeful, the kind of person who doesn't stop to express feeling about what's happening before dealing with what's happening. He caught 2 of the escaped birds immediately and passed them back over the wall to Eliza. Most of its windows were dark. The other two took 7 minutes to corner because they were moving unpredictably through the potato plants and couldn't be herded in the usual way since they had no visual anchor to move toward. When they had all 4 back, Eliza took stock. 30 birds frozen in the corridor, which meant not eating, which meant wasted time. 12 birds back in the pen, requiring restart. 4 birds who now associated the corridor with the bad sound and would be harder to introduce again. And the larvae continuing to feed on the plants the entire time. She crouched down and looked at Scout, who had not moved during any of it. Scout was standing about 4 feet into the first corridor, head slightly tilted, listening. "All right," Eliza said quietly, not to any person. "All right." She went to the back of the frozen group and began slowly and with enormous patience the process of getting them moving again. You sustre. She used a longer grain trail this time, placing small amounts every 8 inches rather than every 1.5 feet, giving the birds something to focus on every few seconds. She kept her whistle softer, shorter. She kept her own movements small. It took an hour and 40 minutes to get the first 40 ducks through the first 2 rows, but they got through. And when they got through, the things she'd theorized in her kitchen 2.5 weeks ago began to happen in the actual dirt of the actual field. The larvae were there, near the soil in the dark spaces under the leaves, at the base of the plants. And the ducks' heads down, bills sweeping, navigating by touch and hearing and instinct found them. She heard the small percussive sounds of bills hitting the earth. She watched bills dip and come up and dip again. The frozen, alarmed birds from that morning began to relax as feeding instinct overtook anxiety, and the sounds of eating settled into a steady, low, constant rhythm. Eliza stood in the row and watched it happen and let herself feel it for exactly 30 seconds. Then she went back to work. What she hadn't fully accounted for was her own body. Not in a defeated way, not in the way that made her stop, but in the accounting way, the way you account for the weather or the soil or any other factor that is simply a fact of the situation. She was a large woman, doing physical work in a field from before dawn until after dark, bending and crouching and walking, and herding and lifting, in late spring heat that was climbing each day. Her legs ached from the thigh down. Her back had moved beyond the ordinary ache she'd gotten used to, and into something sharper, a bright pain along her left side when she twisted certain ways, that she managed by not twisting that way if she could avoid it. What she found, to her own private surprise, was that the physical difficulty didn't demoralize her. It informed her. She started making small adjustments, positioning herself at the corridor entrance rather than walking the full length each time, using the willow switch to extend her reach rather than bending down, letting Roost's training work carry more of the individual bird management so she could focus on the pattern of the whole flock. She was learning the work the same way the ducks were learning the corridors. By doing it. By failing at the first version and adjusting to the second. On the 3rd day of field operation, the larva count in the east section dropped measurably. She checked each evening and noted it in her book. On the 4th day, the west section showed the same. The beetles were not gone, not even close, but the rate of increase had slowed. The ducts of its windows were dark, the ducks were keeping up with the hatch rate, which meant the population wasn't compounding the way it would have without intervention. It was working. She didn't tell Caleb that night. She wrote it in her book, and then she ate supper and she went to bed, and she lay there in the dark, with the knowledge of it sitting in her chest like a coal, warm, real, not yet ready to be spoken because speaking it too soon had a way of changing it into something more fragile. The next morning, Caleb found her record book on the table. She'd left it there by accident when she'd gotten up before him. He was standing at the table with it open when she came in from checking the pen, and he looked up with an expression she'd never seen on him before, or rather, an expression she'd seen only once, on the day she'd told him yes when he asked her. "It's working," he said. "The larvae count is down," she said carefully. "That's what the numbers say. That's the same thing." "Not quite." He set the book down, Eliza. "It's working." She looked at him across the kitchen, morning light coming in through the east window, and she allowed herself, for one moment, to agree. "It's working," she said. Then she picked up her grain pouch and went back to the field. That was the morning Silas Varden showed up with 4 men and stood at the fence for a long time watching. She knew he was there. She could hear the murmur of voices at the roadside fence, and she caught her name once, and Caleb's. And she thought she heard the word mistreating, but couldn't be certain. She kept working. The ducks kept eating. After maybe 20 minutes, she heard the fence creak and footsteps in the field, and she straightened up to find Silas walking toward her between two rows that weren't part of the corridor system, his jaw set and his hands at his sides. "People are saying you're starving those birds," he said, "to make them eat." "People are wrong," she said. "I want to see the pen." She looked at him. "You want to see my pen? I want to see the water stations. The feed you're giving them outside field hours. I want to see they're being treated properly." She was quiet for a moment. There were two ways to take this. One was that Silas was genuinely concerned about the welfare of the ducks. The other was that Silas, whose copper spray was starting to show the limitations she'd suspected it would in a heavy infestation year, was looking for a reason to be right about her. She wasn't sure which one it was. She wasn't sure it mattered. "Come on then," she said. She walked him to the pen. She showed him the water stations, and 4 of them, placed at the cardinal points of the pen so no bird had to navigate more than a few feet to reach water. She showed him the grain. She mixed specific proportions, weighted toward protein to maintain the bird's energy, through intensive field work. She showed him the bedding, the drainage, the section she'd curtained off for any bird that showed signs of stress and needed a few hours removed from the main flock. Silas walked through it all without speaking. He looked at the stress recovery section for a long time. "You built a separate space," he said. "For the ones that need it," she said. "How many have needed it?" 7, at one point or another. "None currently." He nodded. Not the approving kind of nod, the taking inventory kind. "The ones in the field right now," he said. "They're eating well? Moving right? They're doing what I trained them to do," she said. Another silence. Then Silas said, with his back still partly to her, "My east field is at 30% loss." She didn't say anything. "Copper spray held for the first wave," he said. "The second wave came in heavier. Third application isn't taking the way it should." He paused. "I'm not saying your method is sound. I'm saying the spray is having a bad year." "I'm sorry to hear that," she said, and she was. Not for complicated reasons. Just because losing a crop was losing a crop, and she knew how that felt to contemplate. He turned to look at her directly. "How many days until you know?" 3 more days in the field," she said. "If we hold the current rate, we break the life cycle before the second-generation adults can lay." Silas looked at her for a long moment. 3 days, he said. 3 days. He left without another word. She watched him walk back toward the road, and she noticed that his shoulders, which were usually square and set and deliberately upright, in the way of a man who considers posture a statement of character, had something slightly different about them that afternoon. A degree of drop that wasn't there before. A smallness that had nothing to do with his physical size. She recognized it because she'd felt it herself enough times. It was the look of a person whose certainty has developed a crack. That evening, after the ducks were back in the pen, and fed and settled, and after Caleb had eaten and gone to check the fence lines before dark, Eliza sat alone at the kitchen table with her record book and a lamp that needed its wick trimmed and didn't have much time left in it. She wrote down the numbers from the day's field work. Larvae count by row, bird behavior notes, duration in field, comparative damage observations against neighboring fields visible from their fence line. The numbers were good. Not perfect, the northwest corner of the west section was still showing more activity than she'd like, but good. The trend was clear enough that she could follow it forward and see where it pointed. She put the pen down. Her hands hurt. She hadn't noticed during the day because there was always something requiring attention, but now in the quiet, the ache in her knuckles and the roughness of her palms registered properly. She looked at her hands under the lamplight. They were not her mother's hands, which had always been carefully kept. Her mother had been proud of her hands. They were not the hands she'd had when she married Caleb, when she'd still had the particular softness that comes from a life lived mostly indoors. They were working hands, cracked and stained, and capable of things she hadn't known 2 months ago they could do. She looked at them for a while. Outside, she could hear Caleb moving around the barn, the low regular sounds of the last chores of the day. The ducks were quiet in the pen. She could just make out the soft, collective murmur they made when they were settled and content. A sound she'd come to know the way she knew the sounds of the house, particular and identifying. The lamp sputtered. She closed her book, And Wesson sat in the brief darkness then after the flame went out, and she thought about Silas Varden's shoulders and about Ruth Hollis climbing fence rails in defiance of everything her mother had taught her, and about 63 half-blind animals following a sound they had decided to trust. And she thought 3 more days. Then she went to bed, because 3 more days started before dawn, and she couldn't afford to give the Beetles the morning. Most of its windows were dark. 3 more days turned to 2.5 before the first rumor reached them in a form that couldn't be ignored. It came through Caleb, the way most things from the valley came through Caleb. Because he was the one who went to town and stood at counters and exchanged the kind of brief, weather-focused conversation that men in Briar Hollow used as a container for everything they actually meant to say. He came back on a Wednesday afternoon with a sack of salt and a look on his face that she recognized as the specific look of a man who had heard something he didn't want to repeat. She was at the corridor entrance, guiding the last group of ducks in from the field, when he came and stood near her without speaking. She finished the count, all 54 accounted for, plus the 9 that still required individual coaxing, which Ruth had been handling, and then she latched the gate and turned to him. "What happened?" she said. "Nothing happened," he said. "People are talking. People have been talking since before we bought the birds. This is different." He set the salt sack down on the fence post. Ned Berg was at the feed store. He said he heard, and he was clear. He was telling me what he heard would. Not what he knew. He said he heard that you've been running the ducks in the heat without enough water, that some of them are in poor condition. Eliza was quiet for a moment. "You know that's not true." "I know that's not true," Caleb said. "Silas Varden knows it too, because he walked through that pen himself. But Silas isn't the one saying it." "Who is?" Caleb shook his head. "Ned didn't say a name. You know how that goes." She did know how that went. The valley had a particular way of circulating image, and always attributed to someone who heard it from someone else. Always just specific enough to feel credible and just vague enough to be impossible to disprove. She'd watched it happen to other people over the years. She'd never expected to be the subject of it, which was, she realized now, a kind of naivety she should have shed before she'd bought 63 unusual animals and built a structure in her field that looked, she had to admit, genuinely strange to people driving past on the road. "How many people has Ned told?" she asked Eliza. "How many?" "I don't know." "Enough that came back to me before I'd been in town 40 minutes. She picked up her grain pouch from the fence post and hung it on the hook inside the pen door. She did this slowly, taking longer than it required, because she was buying herself time to think rather than react. She'd learned that about herself over the past weeks, that her best thinking happened in the small pauses she manufactured, when everything in her wanted to move immediately. "The crop is 2 days from being secure," she said. 2 days, I know. If someone reports us to the county inspector before then, he'll come out. He'll disrupt the field operation. And even if he clears us, which he would, because there's nothing wrong with those birds, we'll lose days we don't have." Caleb looked at the pen, at the ducks, settling for the evening. "Who would file a report?" "I don't know," she said. "But someone who believed the story and also had a reason to want us to fail." The silence that followed had weight to it. She didn't say Silas Varden's name. She wasn't sure enough to say it, and she'd learned over the years that naming a suspicion prematurely had a way of becoming its own kind of damage. But the thought sat between them like an object on the table, visible to both of them, which neither of them picked up. "What do we do?" Caleb said. "We keep working," she said, "and we work faster." She meant it, but lying in bed that night, she understood it wasn't really an answer. Faster didn't help if the inspector arrived tomorrow morning. Faster didn't close the mouth of whoever was repeating a story that wasn't true. She stared to the ceiling in the dark and turned the problem over the way she turned everything over methodically, looking at each face of it, and what she kept coming back to was this: she could not control what people said. She could only control what the field showed when people looked at it. So she needed more people to look at it. The next morning, she got up an hour earlier than usual, and she walked to the Hollis place. Vera Hollis answered the door in her housecoat, with her hair only partly pinned, which meant Eliza had arrived before the version of Vera that presented itself to the world was fully assembled. There was a brief moment of visible irritation on Vera's face that shifted into something more complicated when she saw who was standing on her porch. "Eliza Rourke," she said. "It's barely 6, I know," Eliza said. "I'm sorry for the hour. I need to ask you something." Vera studied her. Whatever she was looking for in Eliza's face, desperation, maybe, or weakness, she apparently didn't find it in quite the form she expected, because after a moment she stepped back from the door. "Come in, then." The Hollis kitchen smelled like coffee and something baking, and Ruth was already at the table with a book open, which she closed quickly when Eliza came in. The girl's expression went through several things in rapid succession: surprise, then a flicker of guilt that Eliza suspected had to do with whether her mother knew exactly how much time Ruth had been spending at the Rourke farm before settling into something careful and attentive. Eliza sat at the table because Vera gestured her toward a chair, and Vera poured coffee without asking. And for a moment, the three of them were just in a kitchen in the early morning with cups of coffee and the question of what came next. "You've heard the talk," Eliza said. Not a question. Vera wrapped both hands around her cup. "I've heard some." "What have you heard?" "That the ducks aren't being kept properly." Vera paused. "That the whole setup is crueler to those animals than just letting Pruitt put them down when he had the chance." Eliza nodded. "You know that's not true." "I know what Ruth has told me," Vera said, with a point look at her daughter that Ruth met steadily. "And I know that Silas Varden walked through your pen and didn't file any report." "Not yet," Eliza said. The phrase landed. She watched Vera's eyes sharpen. "What I need," Eliza said, "is for people to see the operation for themselves. Not to hear about it from someone who heard about it from someone. To actually come to the field and look." She paused. "You're respected here, Vera. If you came and saw what I was doing and then told people what you saw, it would mean something." Vera was quiet for a long moment. Eliza waited. She was good at waiting. She'd had a lot of practice. "You're asking me to put my name on this," Vera said. "I'm asking you to come look," Eliza said. "That's all. What you say afterward is yours to decide." Another silence. Ruth was watching her mother with an expression that Eliza recognized, the careful, still expression of someone who wants something very much and has learned that wanting it visibly decreases the chances of getting it. "This afternoon," Vera said finally, after the noon meal, most snows were dark. Eliza walked back to her farm through the early morning with the sky going pink ahead of her, and she felt the specific kind of relief that has nothing peaceful about it because there was still everything left to do. She put the ducks in the field by 7. The morning went well, which she noted without trusting. Good mornings had a way of saving their bad news for the afternoon. Most of its windows were dark. She and Caleb worked the rows in the pattern they'd developed him, moving ahead of the flock, shaking the upper sections of the plants to send larvae raining down, her following behind with the switch to keep the birds concentrated on the highest density sections. It was hot work. It was dirty work. By 9 in the morning, she was soaked through and her hair was coming down from where she'd pinned it, and she had mud past her ankles in the worst rows. She didn't think about any of that. She thought about each row as she came to it and the row after that. At 11:30, Caleb went to the pump to wash up, and she sent him with the message that they'd have visitors at noon, and to make the pen look as good as it could, which he understood without requiring elaboration. Vera Hollis came at noon. She brought her husband Martin, who was a quiet man of few words and significant size who said almost nothing, but looked at everything carefully. And she brought 2 other women from the valley, Agnes Pratt, whose husband ran the mill, and Dorothy Crane, who was 60 and had lived in Briar Hollow longer than anyone except possibly Silas Varden. Dorothy was the particular kind of woman who had earned the right to say what she thought by outliving everyone who would have told her not to, and her opinion, once formed, tended to spread through the valley like creek water finding its level. Eliza took them through the pen first. She showed them exactly what she'd shown Silas: the water stations, the feed, the bedding, the stress recovery section. Dorothy Crane crouched down, which at 60 took her a visible moment, and looked through the wire at the ducks with an examining expression. "They're fat," Dorothy said. "They eat well," Eliza said. "Blind ones usually don't when they're in a group. Others crowd them out from the feed." Dorothy straightened up with some effort. "How do you keep that from happening?" "Multiple stations," Eliza said. "And the feeding is timed so they're not competing. They each know where their station is by the position they navigate by counting steps from the door." Dorothy looked at her. "You figured that out yourself?" "I figured out they were doing it," Eliza said. "They figured it out before I did." Dorothy made a sound that was neither approval nor its opposite, which from Dorothy Crane meant she was still thinking. Then Eliza took them to the field. She'd timed it. The flock was at peak feeding activity, right now mid-morning energy, beetles and larvae at their most accessible near the soil, and the sounds and sights of 50-plus active birds working the rows was something that either convinced you or it didn't. She stood at the corridor entrance with Vera and Dorothy and Agnes Pratt and Martin Hollis, and she watched them watch it. Vera's expression moved through several phases. Initial wariness, then a kind of reluctant interest as she clocked the organization of the corridor system. Then something that might have been surprise when she noticed the larvae on the ground being actively consumed. Agnes Pratt pointed at the dirt. "Are those beetle larvae?" Eliza said. "Third instar, most of them now. The ducks find them by sound and touch. They don't need to see them." Agnes looked at the plant above the spot she'd been pointing at. "The leaf looks clean," she said. "Because they've been through here twice already today," Eliza said. Martin Hollis had walked further along the edge of the field and was looking out across the visible section of neighboring properties. Eliza knew what he was seeing. The alderley field to the east was showing the lace pattern damage across at least a third of its visible rows. The Pruitt property, yes. Same Pruitt who'd sold her the ducks, the irony of which she'd noted privately more than once, had already abandoned its most affected section. "Theirs is going," Martin said not loudly. "Just a statement." "Yes," Eliza said. He turned and looked at her field. "Yours isn't." "No." He nodded once and went back to watching the ducks. That was as close to endorsement as Martin Hollis was likely to come, and she suspected it would carry more weight in the valley than anything his wife said, because Martin was known as a man who noticed things and didn't speak unless what he noticed was worth speaking about. Dorothy Crane had moved along the corridor to a spot where she could see 3 rows deep into the operation. She watched for a long time without saying anything. Then she said, "How many days left?" 2, Eliza said. "If today holds, 2 more days breaks the life cycle before the second generation can establish. And if something goes wrong between now and then?" Eliza looked at her steadily. "Then something goes wrong," she said. "That's farming." Dorothy looked back at her with an expression that if she was reading it right, and she thought she was contained something close to respect. "Fair enough," Dorothy said. They left an hour later, and Eliza watched their wagon disappear down the road, and she allowed herself exactly the time it took for the wagon to go from visible to not visible before turning back to the field. Ruth had held the flock through the visit without being asked, keeping them in the north section where the visitors wouldn't disrupt the birds' rhythm. When Eliza came back, Ruth was sitting on the ground at the corridor entrance with Scout standing 3 inches from her knee, and she looked up with the question she wasn't quite asking directly. "Dorothy Crane will talk," Eliza said. Ruth nodded. "Good," she said. "Then you look tired." "I am tired," Eliza said. "Keep moving." She was more tired than she'd admitted to anyone, including herself in the private accounting she did most nights in the few minutes before sleep arrived. The work had been cumulative in the way that serious physical effort was each day taking slightly more than the day before because there was slightly less to draw from. She'd been running on something that wasn't quite energy anymore, something more fundamental, the dull stubbornness of a person who doesn't have a better option than to continue. Her left side was worse. The pain that had started as something she could work around had developed a persistence that worried her more than she let show. Not a sharp pain sharper would have been more alarming, but also more specific. This was a deep, grinding ache that was worst when she first stood after crouching, and sometimes woke her in the night when she shifted wrong. She'd said nothing to Caleb about it because telling him would require them both to think about it, and there was no room in the current situation for both of them to be thinking about her side. The afternoon of that same day, she was in the east section when Caleb found her. She was crouching over a spot where she'd seen unusually dense larval activity earlier in the morning, a section near the irrigation furrow where the soil stayed cooler, and the beetles seemed to prefer it, and she was checking whether the morning's work had cleared it adequately. Caleb crouched beside her. He looked at what she was looking at. "Better," he said. "Better," she agreed. "Not done." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him working up to something. "Ned Berg pulled his south field today," he said. She looked at him. "Pulled it? Gave it up. Said the infestation was too far gone. He's going to try a second planting of something fast. Turnips, maybe. See if he can get something out of the ground before frost." She sat back on her heels. Ned Berg's south field was 40 acres. same size as theirs. How many others, she said. Don't know yet. But when I was in the east section this morning, I could see over to Alderley's fence line. Tom has maybe a quarter of his crop left that looks viable. Maybe. She thought about the bank letter in the tin box under the floorboard. She thought about what it said. She knew what it said because she'd read it twice before Caleb had folded it away, and she had the kind of memory that didn't let things go just because she wanted them to. She thought about the price potato crops would command in a valley where 3 or 4 major producers had lost significant portions of their harvest. She thought about 2 more days. We need to push harder tomorrow, she said. Caleb looked at her. Eliza. There are 2 more days, Caleb. She stood. We push harder. He stood too, and he looked at her in that particular way he had. The one she'd learned over 2 years of marriage was his version of an argument he decided not to have, because he understood she'd already made the decision, and further discussion was not going to change the terrain. All right, he said. The second to last day was the hardest. Not because anything went dramatically wrong. The ducks performed. The larvae count in most sections was low enough to show the method was winning. Caleb worked the upper plants with an energy she could see was costing him, but that he kept producing anyway. Ruth arrived before 7, without being asked, and took the pen duties so that Eliza could focus entirely on field management. It was hard because of what they could see from the field. Tom Alderley's farm was visible in sections from their east fence line, and as the morning wore on, Eliza began to notice movement over there that wasn't the ordinary movement of fieldwork. There were more people than usual. There was a wagon she didn't recognize near the barn. There was the particular quality of activity that happened when people were doing urgent, reactive things rather than planned ones. At midday, she saw Tom Alderley himself at his fence line, looking across at her field, just standing there. She was too far away to read his expression, but she could see the posture, the way his arms hung, the stillness of a man who has stopped being busy, because there's nothing left worth being busy about. She raised a hand. He raised a hand back. That was all. She went back to her rows. In the afternoon of that day, she found Caleb sitting on the ground at the end of the west corridor. He was not sitting in the way of a man taking a planned break. He was sitting in the way of a man who had sat down because his body had decided. It was sitting regardless of whether his mind agreed. His face was the color of the chalky white clay they sometimes hit, when they were digging post holes, not 6 exactly, but drained. Caleb, she said. I'm fine, he said. You're not fine. I just need a minute. She crouched beside him, which cost her, and looked at his face. He was hot, she could see it in the flush at his neck, and the way his eyes looked slightly unfocused. The way eyes looked, the body was running a temperature and trying to regulate things it wasn't managing to regulate. How long, she said. This morning, he admitted, came on slow. Why didn't you? Because we're 2 days out, he said, and looked at her with an expression that didn't require elaboration. She sat beside him in the dirt. Not because she wanted to, not because she had time to, but because he needed her there for a minute, and she was capable of giving him that. I can finish the afternoon, she said. You go in. Drink water, all of it, not a little. Lie down. The upper plants. Ruth can shake the upper plants, she said. She's taller than she looks. He looked at her. She's 15, Eliza. She's capable, Eliza said. I've watched her. He was quiet then. I don't like this. I know. I feel like I'm leaving you out here. You're going inside to recover so you can be useful again tomorrow, she said. That's not the same as leaving. She paused. Go in, Caleb. He went. She watched him walk to the house, checking his pace, measuring it slow but steady, not staggering, which meant it was heat and exhaustion and not something worse. She stayed windows. That assessment for a moment, the way she stayed with assessments until she was sure of them, and then she turned back to the field. She got Ruth, who handled the information about Caleb, with the same matter-of-fact composure she handled everything, and put her on the upper plants for the remaining afternoon rows. Ruth was indeed tall enough, and strong enough, and careful enough not to damage the plants while shaking them, and the ducks followed the fallen larvae with their usual focused efficiency, and the afternoon moved forward the way afternoons do when you stop watching the clock. Eliza worked without stopping, except for water, until the sun dropped below the ridgeline. Then she walked the rows. She turned over leaves. She checked the soil at the base of plants. She looked if its windows were dark. She looked at the evidence the ducks had left the disturbed earth, the absence of larval clusters on the undersides of leaves near the ground, the changed quality of the damage pattern where there was damage. She wrote it all down. She came back to the house and found Caleb in bed, not sleeping, but resting with his eyes open. And she sat on the edge of the mattress and read him the numbers by lamplight. And he listened with his arm across his eyes. And when she finished, he said, "One more day." "One more day," she confirmed. She was still sitting there when the sound came. It started low and distant, which was the only reason she heard it at all over the night sounds of the farm, the insects, the breeze, the distant creak, a frantic high sound, then more of the same sound, then the percussion of something large and quick hitting wood. She was off the bed and out the door before she'd fully registered what she was hearing. By the time she reached the pen, she understood. The sound was the ducks, not their sleeping murmur, not their working sounds, but the panicked, disorganized sound of birds that are terrified and can't see what's terrifying them, which is the worst kind of fear because there's nowhere to run to and every direction feels equally dangerous. The pen gate was open. Not broken open, just open. The latch hanging loose, and in the moonlight she could see birds spread across the yard in every direction, stumbling and clustering, and some of them going in the small tight circles that blind panicked animals went in when they lost all orientation. And at the far end of the pen, where she'd built the stress recovery section with its tighter wire, there was a shape she recognized even in the dark. A fox. It had gotten inside the recovery section, and there were 3 birds in there, the ones she'd moved in yesterday evening, who'd been showing stress indicators, and 2 of them were already down, and the 3rd was pressed into the far corner, and the fox was. She didn't think. She grabbed the willow switch from the hook beside the gate, and she went in. She was not fast. She knew she was not fast, but she was loud and large, and she moved with the kind of absolute purposefulness that apparently was alarming even to a fox in the middle of a meal, because it turned and looked at her, and whatever it saw in her face or her posture made it decide that the 3rd duck in the corner was not worth what was coming at it. It bolted through a gap in the wire that she hadn't known was there. She stood in the recovery section in the dark with the switch in her hand and the 2 birds on the ground, and the 3rd one pressed against the corner wire, shaking, and she became aware that she was shaking too, though for different reasons, and she made herself breathe. Then she called for Caleb. He came, still pale, moving faster than he probably should have given the heat sickness, and together they worked through the next 2 hours, putting the birds back in the pen. Finding them in the dark required the whistle and a lamp and infinite patience, because frightened blind birds did not respond to the whistle the way they responded to it when they felt safe, and several of them went completely still as a fear response, a duck instinct that made them nearly impossible to locate in the dark, even with a lamp. By the time they had 51 confirmed back in the pen, it was past midnight. 11 missing, 2 dead in the recovery section. They found 7 of the 11 over the next 90 minutes by following sound and by checking every space a small frightened animal might wedge itself into under the porch boards, in the space behind the rain barrel, in the gap between the barn wall and the woodpile. Each one they recovered, Eliza carried herself back to the pen because she didn't trust the lamp holder to also manage a frightened bird, and she was large enough and practiced enough with these particular animals that even in their panicked state, they generally stilled somewhat when she picked them up. She found the last 4 at first light. They were in the potato field. They'd found the corridor entrance in the dark she had left it, unlatched the previous morning, and hadn't relatched it before the fox came, which was her mistake. She acknowledged it as her mistake without softening it, and they'd gone in, and they'd found the rows they knew by training and instinct, and the accumulated memory of weeks of work, and they'd settled there in the dark against the bases of the plants. She stood at the corridor entrance, in the gray early light, and looked at them, and she understood something, and it hit her hard enough that she had to put a hand against the fence post to stay steady. The corridors didn't matter. They had never been the thing. She'd built the lanes for the ducks. But the ducks had learned the rows, the smell of the plants, the feel of the particular soil, the sound of the beetles near the surface. That was what they knew. That was what those 4 birds had found in the dark when everything else was terrifying and wrong. She looked at the willow maze, 3 sections of it, torn apart, where the fox had run through it. On its way out, barrel hoops knocked sideways. Boards pulled from their stakes, and she thought, I built the cage, and the birds outgrew it. The lane system had trained them, but the training had produced something that didn't need the lanes anymore. Caleb came up behind her. She heard him before she saw him. He stood beside her and looked at the damage and then at the 4 ducks in the rows, and she could feel him doing the same calculation she'd already finished. The 2 dead birds. The 11 that had been missing and mostly recovered. The destroyed sections of corridor. The state of both of them exhausted, filthy, Caleb still feverish, her side a grinding constant in her left flank. The fact that today was supposed to be the last day. We can't rebuild it in time, Caleb said. No, she said. So he stopped, Eliza. What do we do? She looked at the 4 ducks in the rows. She looked at Scout, who was among the 4, systematically bill sweeping the soil between 2 plants, with the same methodical pattern she'd been using since she was still in Pruitt's pen. She picked up her grain pouch. She picked up the willow switch. She put 2 fingers in her mouth and whistled 2 notes, low then high, and in the yard behind her she heard the flock respond, the shuffle and stir of birds who were frightened and exhausted and had spent the worst night of their lives, lifting their heads toward a sound they had decided a long time ago to follow. We heard them, she said. Caleb looked at her. We don't need the corridors, she said. They know the rows. We put them in ourselves. We move them where we need them. We concentrate them on the worst sections. She looked at him. 61 ducks, both of us moving them by hand. One day. He was quiet for a long moment. She watched his face go through several things. The practical objections, and there were practical objections, she could have listed them herself. The physical reality of what she was proposing for 2 people who were already running on empty. The slim margin they were working with, and the number of ways this could fail. Most of its windows were dark. And then the thing that was always underneath with Caleb, the thing that had made her say yes when asked, the thing she'd been grateful for on many days and some very long nights. He looked at what was possible instead of what wasn't sought. All right, he said. She whistled again. The flock came toward the sound. The flock came toward the sound. The way they always did, not all at once, not cleanly, but in the way of creatures that have learned something and are choosing to act on what they've learned, which is different from being forced. Scout moved first, then the core group, then the secondary birds, then the last of the uncertain ones, the 9 that had always required more patience, stumbling forward in the gray early light with the particular awkward earnestness that Eliza had stopped finding pitiable about 3 weeks ago and had started finding something closer to admirable. 61 birds. 2 empty spaces in the count where there had been 63. She didn't let herself look at the recovery section where the 2 were still lying. That was a thing for later. Right now there was a field and a last day, and she whistled again and began walking toward the corridor entrance, and the flock came with her. Ruth arrived before 7, the same way she'd been arriving, over the fence before the road got busy. She stopped at the edge of the yard when she saw the destroyed sections of corridor, the gate still hanging open, the general evidence of what the night had produced. She looked at Eliza with a question that she had enough sense not to ask out loud. Fox, Eliza said, lost 2 birds. Ruth's face did something brief and controlled. She was 15 years old, and she had been coming to this farm every morning for nearly 2 weeks, and those birds were as familiar to her as anything in her own life right now. Eliza saw all of that cross the girl's face in about 3 seconds, and then Ruth pressed her mouth into a flat line and said, What do we need to do? No corridors today, Eliza said. We heard them ourselves. I'll lead with the whistle. Caleb will work the plants ahead of the flock. I need you behind the group, keeping the stragglers moving. You'll use the switch, not to hit them, just to signal direction. They know the switch by now. Ruth looked at the flock, then back at Eliza. How do we keep them concentrated on one section at a time without the walls? It was exactly the right question. Eliza had been working on the answer since before first light. You and I form the walls, she said. I stay at the head of the group. You stay at the back. We move slowly enough that the birds between us feel contained. They'll fill the space we give them. Ruth thought about this for a moment. We're the corridor, she said. We're the corridor, Eliza confirmed. Most of its windows were dark. They started at the northeast corner of the field, which was the section she was least worried about. The ducks had covered it thoroughly in the previous days, and the larval count there had been the lowest on her last check. She wanted to start where the work was manageable while she figured out how the new method actually functioned in practice, as opposed to how she'd theorized it would function at 4 in the morning when theory was all she had. Caleb went ahead of them into the first row. He was still pale, still moving with the careful deliberateness of a man whose body was slightly unreliable beneath him. But he was upright and he was working, and that was what she needed. He took the long willow switch she'd given him longer than hers, almost 5 feet, which gave him the reach to shake the upper sections of the plants without bending, and he started at the first plant and worked forward. The larvae fell. The ducks ate. The first row took 40 minutes, which was longer than it had taken with the corridors, but shorter than she'd feared. The herding was imprecise at first, birds drifting sideways out of the formation, requiring Ruth to move quickly to block them and redirect. A few of the secondary group birds getting confused when the boundaries they expected weren't there. But the core group stayed focused. Scout stayed focused. And the birds that followed Scout followed him into the row and kept eating, because eating was what their instinct said to do here. And their instinct had been carefully built for weeks to say exactly that. By the second row, Eliza had a clearer feel for the pace and the spacing. She adjusted her position closer to the center of the flock, rather than directly at the head, which allowed her to respond faster when birds drifted either direction without losing the whistle's directional pull. She whistled less frequently, trusting the flock's internal momentum more, using the sound to mark transitions between rows rather than to maintain constant direction. By the fourth row, it was working, not smoothly. She wasn't going to use that word about anything that happened that day. But it was working in the sense that the flock was moving through the rows, the birds were eating, and the system she'd improvised out of desperation at 5 in the morning was producing the result it needed to produce. She let herself have exactly that thought, and nothing more optimistic than that. The sun climbed. The heat came with it. By 9 o'clock, it was the kind of heat that pressed down rather than simply rising. The kind that made the air above the rows shimmer slightly and made the soil give off a smell that was partly good growth and partly something sharper underneath. Eliza's clothing was soaked through before 9:30. She stopped noticing it the way you stopped noticing the sound of the creek after a while. It was just a condition of the environment, not a thing requiring attention. Her side was bad. She'd known it would be bad. She'd been managing it since she got out of bed before dawn, managing it the way she managed most physical difficulties, which was by refusing to allocate mental space to it, beyond the minimum required to keep from injuring herself further. The grinding in her left flank had sharpened over the previous 2 days into something more insistent, and when she moved quickly, turning to redirect a bird, stepping over a fallen section of willow corridor, it produced a bright, brief spike of pain that she absorbed without showing. Ruth noticed anyway. Around the 7th row, Ruth came up alongside her during a brief pause while Caleb repositioned ahead of them, and she said quietly, "Not making a thing of it, your side." "It's fine," Eliza said. "It doesn't look fine. It doesn't matter right now," Eliza said, which was different from fine, and Ruth was sharp enough to catch the difference, but also practical enough to accept it. "Tell me what to do differently so you're moving less," Ruth said. Eliza looked at her. "I can take more of the repositioning," Ruth said. "If I stay wider more toward the outside of the group, I can block the stragglers before they drift as far. You'd only need to handle the front." It was a good adjustment, better than the one Eliza had been running. She rearranged the formation in her head, checked it for problems, found one that was easily solved by shifting her whistle timing. "Yes," she said. "Do that." Ruth moved out to the wider position without ceremony, and Eliza felt the difference in her own workload within about 3 minutes. The constant repositioning she'd been doing on the right flank dropped by more than half. She was still moving, still covering ground, but the particular lateral motion that had been aggravating her snide most severely was reduced. Most of its windows were dark, and the reduction was enough to take the pain from something she was fighting down to something she was simply managing. It was a 15-year-old girl who solved it, and Eliza filed that fact away without embarrassment. They stopped at midday for water and 10 minutes in the shade of the barn wall. Caleb sat against the wall with his legs out in front of him and his eyes closed, and Eliza sat beside him and drank and tried to do a row count in her head against what remained. They were through the northeast corner and most of the north's center section. The west sections were harder, denser planting, higher larval activity in the pre-fox days. In the southwest corner, near the irrigation furrow, was the section she'd been most worried about since the beginning. That was where they still needed to go. Caleb opened his eyes. "How many rows?" 18, she said. "Maybe 20. He didn't respond to that immediately. She watched him do the same calculations she was doing, measuring their current pace against the hours of daylight remaining and against his own body, which she could see was requiring more from us just to stay upright than it normally did. "I can do it," he said. "I know you can," she said, which was true. And then, "But you don't have to do all of it. Ruth and I can run the last section if you get us through the first half." He looked at her. "Ruth's 15. Ruth is about the most capable person on this property today," Eliza said, "and I say that with full awareness of who's sitting next to me." Something shifted in Caleb's expression. Not quite a smile, he was too tired and too uncomfortable for a smile, but the thing that lived under a smile when the circumstances didn't allow the surface expression. "You're being diplomatic," he said. "I'm being accurate." He drank the rest of his water. "Let's go," he said. They went. The afternoon wore on in the particular way of afternoons that you are trying to get through, not slowly exactly, but with a density to each hour that made the hours feel like more than 60 minutes. Row by row, section by section. The ducks worked with a consistency that Eliza had stopped taking for granted every time she watched them. She was aware that their performance was the product of weeks of patient, painful work, and that the birds themselves had no understanding of the stakes, no concept of the bank letter in the tin box, or the neighbors' fields going brown, and they ate with the same focused efficiency they'd brought to every session, because eating was what they did, and these rows were where they did it. She found herself grateful for that, in a way she couldn't have articulated to anyone. The ducks didn't know they were saving the farm. They were just doing what they'd learned. There was something clean about that, something that didn't require anything of her emotionally, which on this particular day was a mercy. Around 2 in the afternoon, they hit the southwest corner. She'd been right to worry about it. The irrigation furrow ran along the west edge of this section, and the extra moisture in the soil had created conditions the beetles apparently preferred, because even with the ducks' work in the previous days, this section was showing higher larval density than anywhere else remaining. Caleb shook the first plant, and what fell was significantly more than what they'd been seeing. In the cleaner sections, not dramatically, not hopelessly, but enough that she recalculated on the fly. "Slower through here," she said to Caleb. "Shake twice. Wait longer between plants." He nodded. He was visibly flagging now. The deliberate, focused energy she'd seen in him this morning had thinned down to something more like determination running on fumes, which she recognized because she was running the same fuel. Ruth, on the other hand, Ruth was tired, clearly, but she had the particular reserve of youth that showed up most in the comparison to adults who had been at it longer. She kept her position at the wider flank. She kept her movements precise and economical. When a bird drifted, she moved to block it with the minimum necessary response, rather than chasing or overcorrecting, which was the technique Eliza had taught her, but which required more composure to execute when you were tired than when you were fresh. They were 4 rows into the southwest corner when the riders appeared at the road fence. Eliza saw them from the corner of her eye, 3 horses, and then a 4th, pulling up at the fence line. She kept her attention on the flock for a long moment before she allowed herself to look properly, because 4 rows from finishing the last section was not the time to get distracted by whoever was at the fence. Then she looked. Silas Varden, Tom Alderley. Two men she didn't recognize from this distance, though one of them had the look of a county official, something about the way he was dressed relative to the others. Neater than a farmer, but dusty enough to have traveled. Her stomach did something complicated. "Keep moving," she said to Ruth, to Caleb, to herself in whatever order applied. She heard the fence creak, and she heard footsteps coming toward the field, and she told herself, "Finish the row. Whatever is coming, finish the row first." She finished the row. Caleb had heard the footsteps too, and had paused at the end of the row, his switch at his side, watching the approaching men. Ruth stood at the flank of the flock, with the careful stillness of someone who can read a situation and is waiting to understand what it requires. Silas stopped about 6 feet from where Eliza was standing. The man she'd tentatively identified as a county official was beside him, mid-50s, wire-rimmed spectacles, a coat that was too warm for the weather, but that he seemed to consider part of his professional identity. "This is Harrison Coles," Silas said, County Agricultural Inspector. Eliza looked at Harrison Coles. He looked back at her with the expression of a man who prefers to assess before he speaks. "Ma'am," he said. "Mr. Coles," she said. "I've received a report regarding the management of animals on this property," he said. "Specifically, 63 ducks being run in conditions constituting inhumane." "You want to see the pen," Eliza said. He paused. "I want to inspect them." "The pen is there." She pointed without turning to face him fully, keeping one eye on the flock, which had begun the soft milling motion they did when the forward movement stopped. "You can see it from here. The water stations are on all 4 sides. The bedding was changed this morning. The stress recovery section is in the northeast corner of the pen." She paused. "2 birds died last night in a fox attack. That is the full extent of what has gone wrong with these animals under my care, and I can show you exactly how it happened and exactly what I've done since to prevent it happening again." Harrison Coles looked at the pen. He looked at the ducks in the rows beside her. He looked at the condition of the birds, which were, she knew, objectively fine, well-fed, alert in the way they were alert, responsive to sound and movement, navigating the row bases with the practiced ease of animals that were comfortable in their environment. He looked at Silas Varden. Silas was looking at the field, not at Eliza, at the rows, the ducks, at the field, and the rows they still had to cover, and the particular quality of the plant canopy in the sections they'd completed, which was green in a way that stood out against what was visible of the neighboring properties. Silas's jaw was working slightly. She'd noticed he did that when he was thinking hard about something he didn't want to think about. "I'll have a look at the pen," Cole said. He said it in a different tone than he'd opened with. Not an apology. This man didn't do apologies in the first 5 minutes of anything but a recalibration. "Ruth," Eliza said, and Ruth came immediately to take the flock position while Eliza walked Coles to the pen. She took him through it the same way she'd taken Silas, the same way she'd taken Vera Hollis and Dorothy Crane and Agnes Pratt. She was very tired, and her side ached, and she had a field to finish before the light failed, and so she did it efficiently, pointing to what needed pointing to, answering questions without elaborating beyond what was asked. Coles was thorough. She'd give him that. He checked the water, he checked the bedding, he opened the feed bin and looked at the grain. He measured the pen dimensions with his eye against the number of birds. He crouched with some difficulty. She noted without satisfaction and looked through the wire at the birds currently in the pen, which were the ones she'd rotated out of field duty for this afternoon's midpoint rest. He stood up. "The mortality," he said. "2 birds, you said. Fox intrusion. Last night," she said, "I went in and drove it off. Here's where it got through the wire." She showed him the gap, which she'd marked with a piece of red yarn this morning so she could find it efficiently when she needed to. "I'll be repairing that this evening." Coles looked at the gap, looked at the 2 birds who were no longer in the pen, which were in the ground behind the barn, under 2 inches of soil because there was no dignified alternative, and she'd done it herself before Caleb was up. "Who filed the report?" Eliza asked. Coles looked at her. "I'm not at liberty. I'm not asking for a name," she said. "I'm asking whether whoever filed it has been to this property." Pause. "I don't believe so," he said. She nodded. "Then they described something they hadn't seen," she said, "which I think you can now confirm." Another pause, longer this time. "The pen appears to be in order," Coles said. He said it carefully, the way men in official positions say things when they're acknowledging they were sent on an errand that shouldn't have been an errand. "Thank you," she said. "I have a field to finish." She turned and walked back to the rows. Silas Varden was still there. Tom Alderley had moved further along the fence line and was watching the ducks work the southwest corner with an expression she couldn't read from behind. Caleb had apparently decided that the official business was going to resolve itself one way or another and had gone back to working the plants, because she could see him 4 rows down, switching the upper sections methodically, and she could hear the sound of it, the slap of the switch, the small shower of larvae, the bill sounds of the birds at the soil, and the ordinary, functional sound of it after everything that had just happened, made her throat do something she wasn't going to allow at this moment. She went back to the flock. Scout was at the head of the group, Bill sweeping in the familiar left-right pattern. The birds had maintained reasonable formation during her absence, because Ruth had held them steady, and she came back to her position at the center with the gratitude of someone returning to a thing that works. She whistled. The flock moved into the next row. She didn't look at Silas Varden again for the next 2 hours. She was aware of him in the way she was aware of the heat and the ache in her side, present, factored in, not allowed to occupy more space than it required. The rows went. Slower through the dense sections, faster where the previous day's work had already thinned the population. Caleb pushed himself through what she could see was genuine physical difficulty without complaint, pausing sometimes at the end of a row for 30 seconds, with his head down and his hand on his knee before moving to the next one, and she let him have those 30 seconds, and not a moment more, which she knew sounded hard, but which was what they both needed right now. Ruth was extraordinary. She'd used that word privately to herself because it was accurate and accuracy mattered. The girl held the flank with a steadiness and attentiveness that belonged to someone with twice her experience, and she adapted to the shifting conditions of each row soil softness, plant density, beetle concentration without being directed. Somewhere in the past 2 weeks, she'd developed a feel for the work that was genuinely her own. Not mimicry of Eliza, but her own version of the same understanding, arrived at through the same process of watching and adjusting and watching again. At 4 in the afternoon, Tom Alderley called out from the fence. "You need us another set of hands?" Eliza looked up. Tom was at the field fence, his hat in his hands, which she'd rarely, if ever, seen him without. He had the look of a man who has been standing next to his decision for a while and has just finished making it. She looked at Caleb, who gave her a nod that cost him some visible effort but was genuine. "Yes," she said to Tom, "come in." Tom Alderley climbed the fence. He was 43 and stiff, and it took him a moment, and she handed him a willow switch and put him on the opposite flank from Ruth and spent about 90 seconds explaining what he needed to do, because Tom was a farmer, and farmers understood physical problems in fields, and he didn't need more than 90 seconds. He took to it well. He was intuitive with it in the way people were when they'd spent decades reading how animals moved, and within 2 rows, he was holding the right position without correction. Through Speenit. The 3 of them, Eliza, Ruth, Tom moved the flock through the last rows of the southwest corner, while Caleb worked the plants ahead of them with everything he had left. The last row. She knew it was the last row because she'd been counting. She always knew where she was in a count. She didn't say it out loud. She'd learned not to say last row out loud, the same way she'd learned not to say almost done, because those phrases had a way of making the remaining distance feel further rather than shorter. But she knew. Caleb shook the last plant in the last row. The larvae fell, the ducks ate, and then there was nothing left to shake. Caleb stood at far end of the field with his switch at his side and his head slightly bowed, and she watched his shoulders rise and fall with a breath that was longer than ordinary breathing. He stood like that for a moment. Then he looked back at her. She held up one hand, not a wave exactly, more like an acknowledgement. Like, "Yes, we are here." He held his up in return. They began walking the flock back to the pen. It was a slower process than the field work. Tired birds, tired people, the particular looseness of a group that has done what it came to do and has no urgency left. Scout led in his usual way. The secondary birds followed. The uncertain ones came last, their short legs working with the same earnest effort that had always moved her, more than she'd expected it to. Tom Alderley helped pen them, and then stood with his hat still in his hands, looking at the birds settling into their evening routine. "I owe you an apology," he said. He wasn't looking at her when he said it, he was looking at the pen. "I stood at that fence with Silas and laughed." He paused. That wasn't right. Eliza looked at him. His face had the quality of a man saying something that is costing him more than the words alone cost. "You didn't know," she said. "I should have looked before I laughed," he said. "Knowing would have been easy enough if I'd looked." She didn't argue with that, because it was true, and because Tom didn't need her to argue with it. He'd already done the argument himself. "My south field is 40% gone," he said. "Maybe more by now. I'm sorry," she said. He put his hat back on. "Dorothy Crane told my wife about what she saw here. Said the birds were working well." He paused. "I wanted to see it myself before I came and said anything." "You came at a good time," she said. A brief silence. Then, "You going to know by morning?" Whether it held. "I'll walk the field tonight," she said, and again at first light. He nodded. He was quiet for another moment, and she could see he wanted to say something else but was not sure how to shape it. She waited. "That girl," he said finally, glancing toward where Ruth was filling the water stations. "That's Vera Hollis's girl?" Ruth, Eliza said. "Yes." "She work here every day?" "Most days." Tom made a sound she couldn't fully interpret. "Vera know that?" "Vera knows Ruth comes to look at the ducks," Eliza said carefully. Something crossed Tom's face that might have been amusement. "Right," he said. "Well." He looked at the pen one more time. "Good evening, Mrs. Rourke." "Good evening, Tom." He climbed back over the fence and rode away, and the light was going gold by then. That particular late afternoon gold that made everything in Briar Hollow look briefly like something from a painting. All the rough edges softened, and the dirt made amber, and even the damaged willow corridor sections looking merely rustic rather than wrecked. She stood at the pen for another moment, listening to the ducks settle. Scout found his usual spot near the East Water Station, with an accuracy that still surprised her, since the station was in the same position it had always been, and Scout had apparently calibrated the distance from the pen gate down to something like 12 steps, which he executed the same way every evening. She could hear Caleb at the pump, washing his hands and face with the particular thoroughness of someone who is also washing the day off along with the dirt. Ruth had finished the water stations and was standing nearby, waiting in the manner of someone who has done with the physical task, and is now in the moment before knowing whether they can go home. "Good day's work," Eliza said to her. Ruth's face did something brief and real. Not the composed, careful expression she mostly wore. Something younger than that, and less managed. "Do you think it worked?" she said. "I'll know in the morning," Eliza said. Ruth absorbed this. Most of its windows were dark. Then she climbed the fence and walked away across the cooling field, and Eliza watched her until the girl became a silhouette against the low sun and then disappeared over the ridge. The farm went quiet. Caleb appeared at her shoulder, clean-faced, still moving carefully but steadier than he'd been. 2 hours ago, the way fever sometimes broke in the late afternoon when the worst of the day's heat released. "Come eat something," he said. "In a minute," she said. He went inside. She stood at the pen in the last of the light, listening to 61 birds, settling into ordinary sounds, the sounds of animals that are fed and sheltered and have no awareness of what they've spent the day doing or what depended on it. Then she went inside and ate cold cornbread and half a bowl of soup and went to bed while the sun was barely down. And she was asleep before Caleb finished clearing the plates, which she knew because she didn't hear him come to bed. She woke at 4 in the morning, not from a sound, just from the thing inside her that had been keeping count and knew. Now. She pulled on her boots in the dark. The crack left one, the mud in the heel, and she took the lamp and went out to the field alone. She started at the northeast corner. She turned over every leaf she came to. She checked the soil at the base of each plant. She moved slowly through each row, the lamp held low, reading the undersides of leaves the way she'd been reading them for weeks now. And she noted everything in the small book she'd brought with the pencil stub she'd been carrying in her apron pocket since the beginning of all this. Row by row, section by section. The night was very quiet. The creak sound in the distance, the occasional sound from the pen, a duck shifting in its sleep. The particular quality of dark that came in the hour before dawn when even the insects were winding down. She was in the south center section, 2/3 through the field, when she stopped and stayed stopped longer than she'd stopping at each plant. She turned over the leaf again, then the leaf beside it, then the one beside that. She set the lamp down on the ground between 2 rows and crouched there with her hands on her knees in the dark. And she stayed in that position for a while, just looking at what the lamplight showed her and what it didn't show her. No eggs, no larvae. The leaves were clean. She picked up the lamp and kept going, row after row after row, all the way to the southwest corner near the irrigation furrow where the density had been highest, and where she'd had the most doubt. She turned over every leaf she could reach. She checked the soil at the base of every plant. She stood up slowly from the last plant in the last row and pressed her free hand against the small of her back and looked out at the field around her, the lamp making a small circle of yellow light that showed the nearest rows clearly and let the rest dissolve into dark. She stood there for a long time. The first gray light was starting at the eastern edge of the sky when she finally turned and walked back toward the house. She moved slowly, Not because she had to, but because she was letting something settle inside her that needed settling, something that had been wound very tight for a very long time, and was only now, carefully beginning to release. Her boots made their usual sound on the porch steps. She went inside. Caleb was asleep. She sat at the table in the early gray light with her record book open in front of her, and she wrote in it, in her plain, undecorated hand, no eggs, no larvae, no beetles. She closed the book. She folded her hands on the table and sat there in the quiet kitchen while the light came slowly through the east window, and she let herself, for the first time since April, feel the full weight of what they had done without immediately moving on to the next thing that needed doing. It lasted about 4 minutes. Then she got up and started the fire for breakfast. Caleb came downstairs to the smell of fire and coffee and found Eliza at the stove with her back to him, and he stood in the doorway for a moment watching her before he said anything. She heard him anyway. She always heard him. "Well?" he said. She turned around. She didn't say anything immediately, and he read her face the way he'd been reading it for 2 years, which meant he understood before she opened her mouth. He sat down at the table, hard the way a man sits when his legs decide before he does. He put both hands flat on the table and looked at them, and then looked up at her. "All of it," he said. "All of it," she said. "Every row. I checked twice on the southwest corner." He made a sound. Not a word, just a sound, low and compressed, the kind that carries more than words do when there aren't words adequate to the situation. He pressed his lips together and looked back at his hands, and she watched his jaw work once, and then he got himself steady and looked up again. "The field is clean," he said, like he was testing the phrase. "The field is clean," she said. She poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from him, and they drank in the kind of silence that isn't hot or empty, but is instead full of everything that doesn't need to be said because both people are already holding it. Outside, the morning was coming in properly, now the light going from gray to pale gold, the first sounds of birds in the tree line east of the property. In the pen, she could hear the ducks beginning their morning sounds, the soft, collective murmur of 61 birds waking up to a day that was, for them, simply the next day. No different from any other, no awareness of what the last several weeks had cost or what they'd produced. She envied them that, briefly and without bitterness. "We need to tell the bank," Caleb said. "After we harvest," she said. "Not before." He looked at her. "We tell them when we have something to show," she said. "Not when we have a clean field that could still get hit by early frost or flood or any other thing between now and harvest." He thought about this. "Fair," he said. "Also," she said, "we need to know what the potato price is going to do." Caleb wrapped both hands around his cup. "Tom Alderley's down 40%. Ned Berg pulled his south field entirely. From what I could see when I was in town, at least 2 other operations are going to come in well under normal, which means the price per bushel goes up," she said. Significantly, he agreed. She'd been doing this math since sometime around 2 in the morning when she was in the southwest corner with the lamp and the clean leaves and the numbers running in her head the way numbers always ran when there was nothing else to occupy them. She hadn't told Caleb about the math yet. She'd wanted to be sure of the field before she said anything about what came after the field. "If prices hold where they should given the valley losses," she said, "we can pay the banknote in full, not just the extension, the full amount." Caleb went very still. She watched him process this. He was a careful man with careful expectations, which came from growing up in a house where expectations that got too large had a way of making the eventual reality worse by comparison. He didn't let himself want things loudly. He kept his wanting quiet and internal and only showed it afterward when the thing had already arrived and was safe to acknowledge. "In full," he said. "In full," she said, "with enough left over to repair the pen properly. Replace the corridor sections. Buy winter feed without borrowing." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You knew this when you bought the ducks." "I thought it was possible," she said, "if it worked. And if the infestation was bad enough valley-wide to affect prices." "That's a lot of ifs," he said. "Yes," she said, "it was." He looked at her across the kitchen table in the early morning light, and she could see him doing what he sometimes did, recalibrating his understanding of what she'd actually been carrying those first weeks, when she'd seemed calm, when she'd been training ducks and writing in her book, and coming in from the field with mud to her knees. How much of that calm had been genuine, and how much of it had been the performance of calm required to keep them both moving? She hadn't lied to him. She'd just not shown him the full depth of the bet. How scared were you? He asked. Just that. Not an accusation. She thought about it honestly. Most of the time, she said. But scared and stopped aren't the same thing. He nodded slowly. No, he said, they're not. He got up and came around the table, and he put his hand on top of her head for a moment, not a grand gesture, just his hand there, warm and real, and then he went out to start the morning chores, and she sat with her coffee and watched the light come fully into the kitchen and felt the particular quality of a morning after something is over. Not triumph. Something quieter than triumph. The feeling of a floor under your feet after a long time of not being sure the floor would hold. The word traveled faster than she expected. She didn't know precisely how it moved through Dorothy Crane, probably, and through Tom Alderley, and through whatever conversation Harrison Coles, the county inspector, had with his colleagues when he got back to his office and filed his report, which she understood would say something considerably different from what the anonymous complaint had alleged. Word in Briar Hollow moved the way water moved in the valley, finding the lowest channels and filling them quickly. And by the second day after the field check, there were people coming by the road fence to look. Not many at first. 2 or 3 in a morning, pausing their wagons at the fence line and looking at the potato rows, which were visibly, obviously, unmistakably green in a landscape that was going increasingly brown around them. The contrast was stark enough that you didn't need to know anything about beetles or ducks or corridor systems to see it. You just needed eyes and about 30 seconds of looking. She didn't go out to explain herself to the people at the fence. She had work to do, and she did it, and if someone called to her, she answered briefly and without elaborating, because she'd learned over the past several weeks that elaboration was not what changed people's minds. What changed people's minds was evidence, and the evidence was standing there in 40 rows of healthy green plants, and it didn't need her to narrate it. On the 4th day after the field check, Silas Varden came back. He came alone this time. No Tom Alderley, no county inspector, no audience at the fence. He came in the mid-morning when she was in the pen doing the post-field check on the birds, rotating the ones that had been working hardest into the rest section, checking feet and bills and eyes, the basic accounting she'd been doing since the beginning. She heard his horse on the road, and then the particular sound of a man tying a horse at a fence post, and then footsteps, and then nothing, which meant he was standing and waiting rather than coming to her. She finished with the bird she was checking. Then she went to the gate. Silas was standing 10 feet from the pen, his hat in his hands. She'd noticed this was happening more, the hat in the hands. Men in Briar Hollow kept their hats on, as a matter of habit and principle. The hat came off for certain specific situations, and she was apparently one of them now, which she was still figuring out how to feel about. Silas. She said, Mrs. Rourke, he said. The married name this time. She filed that away without commenting on it. He looked at the pen for a moment, then at the field behind her, then at her. I walked my east field this morning, he said. I've lost 52%. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say to that which wouldn't be either hollow consolation or a kind of victory she didn't want to claim. And she understood the difference well enough to stay quiet. The copper spray held the first wave, he said, same as it usually does. I told myself it was working. He paused. The second wave came in heavier than I've seen in a long time. It was a heavy year, she said. Yes, he looked at his hat. Dorothy Crane has been talking to people. I imagine she has, Eliza said. She said you walked through the field the night it finished. To check. I did, alone, in the dark, with a lamp. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. The silence had a different quality from the silences she'd had with him before. Those silences had the quality of a man's deciding how to hold his ground. This one was different. This was the silence of a man standing on ground he knew had shifted under him and was working out where he was now. I said things, Silas said, at the beginning. When you first set up the structure, he seemed to decide not to use the word circus, which she appreciated. I said them loud enough that other people heard. You said what you believed, she said. That doesn't make it right to say. She looked at him. He was 61 years old and had been farming this valley for 35 of those years and had been right about enough things that being wrong was genuinely unfamiliar territory for him. She could see that. She could also see that he was here anyway, standing in front of her with his hat in his hands, which meant the being wrong was not going to stop him from doing what he'd decided had to be done. She respected that. She didn't say so. You were working from what you knew, she said. What you knew was true for most seasons and most situations. Not this one. Not this one, she agreed. He looked up. The report that was filed with Coles, he said. I want you to know I didn't file it. She held his gaze. I know, she said, a brief pause. You know? You'd already walked the pen yourself, she said. You knew the birds were in good condition. You wouldn't file a report on something you knew was false. She paused. Whatever else, Silas, you're not that. Something moved in his face. It wasn't quite emotion, or it was emotion that he was holding at arm's length because he wasn't comfortable with it closer than that. But it was something. Who did file it, she said. Not aggressively. She'd been wanting to know, and he was the person in the valley most likely to know. He was quiet for a moment. A man who heard a story and believed it and thought he was doing right by the animals, he said carefully. Not someone who wished you harm. Someone who was misinformed. She turned this over. She thought about the voice she'd heard in the dark, outside her door. The men on horses, the word circus with laughter around it. She thought about how damage moved in a valley, how it found the channels, how it spread without anyone necessarily intending it to spread. All right, she said. Silas put his hat back on. He looked at the potato field one more time. In the morning light, with the ducks in the pen behind her and the rows stretching out ahead of them, it looked like exactly what it was, a working farm that had survived something that most working farms around it hadn't. When you harvest, he said, the price per bushel is going to be higher than it's been in years. I know, she said. You planned for that. It wasn't a question. I thought it was possible, she said, which was what she'd told Caleb because it was accurate, and accuracy was what she had. Silas looked at her for a long moment. She had the feeling he was seeing her differently from how he'd been seeing her since they'd moved to Briar Hollow, and she was trying to decide whether that felt like something she'd wanted or something that had simply become inevitable regardless of wanting. There are going to be people who want to learn what you did, he said, after the harvest, when it's clear how the season fell. I know that too, she said. Will you teach them? She'd been thinking about this as well. Not all night, not the way she'd been thinking about the field and the beetles and the price per bushel. But she'd thought about it, the way you thought about things that were coming toward you, whether you were ready or not. Yes, she said. Silas nodded. He turned to go, then stopped. He turned back. She had the distinct impression he was about to say something he'd been rehearsing, and that the rehearsed version wasn't quite coming out the way he'd planned. You're a good farmer, Mrs. Rourke, he said. He said it plainly, without decoration, the way men of his type offered the things that cost them the most. She didn't let herself feel the full weight of that until he was gone. Then she stood at the pen gate for a minute in the quiet and felt it, just for a minute, and it was heavier than she'd expected and also lighter, both at once, in the way that things you've wanted for a long time sometimes felt when they finally arrived. Then she went back to checking her birds. The harvest came in the second week of August. It came in over 4 days of hard work. Her and Caleb and Ruth, who had by this point simply ceased to go home before noon and whose mother had apparently decided, with the pragmatism of a woman who understood lost battles, to accept this as a temporary condition of the summer rather than a personal defeat. Vera Hollis sent food twice during the harvest week, which Eliza took as the closest thing to an apology and endorsement that Vera was capable of producing simultaneously, and she accepted it with genuine gratitude, because they were tired, and the food was good, and gratitude cost nothing. The potatoes came up clean. All 40 acres. Every row that the ducks had worked, every section she'd tracked in her little book, every plant she'd checked by lamplight in the early hours of a morning that felt like a long time ago now. She and Caleb dug and sorted and crated and loaded, and Ruth did work that would have tired a grown man. And none of them talked much, because there wasn't much that needed saying that wasn't being said by the crates filling up in the barn. On the third day of harvest, Tom Alderley came with 2 of his farmhands and helped without being asked. He just showed up at 7 in the morning and looked at what needed doing and started doing it. She fed them at noon, and they worked until the light failed, and they came back the next morning and finished the job. At the end of it, Tom stood in the barn looking at the crates, stacked 4 high along 2 walls, and said, "That's a full crop." That's a full crop, Caleb confirmed. Tom shook his head slowly. Not a negative gesture. The gesture of a man recalibrating his understanding of the world. What are you going to do with the ducks this winter? Tom asked. Eliza leaned against the barn door. Her legs ached from 4 days of harvest work, and her side had finally begun to ease in the weeks since the field crisis, down to a manageable discomfort that the doctor in town had called a strained ligament and told her would resolve with rest, which had made her nod and which she had interpreted as resolve with a different kind of work until the other work is done. Keep them, she said. Build them a proper winter pen. Work them on the fall cover crops. They'll work cover crops, Tom said. They'll work anything that has insects in it, she said, which is most things. Tom looked at Scout, who was visible through the barn door at the edge of the pen, doing his evening navigation with the 12-step sequence from gate to water station. That particular one, Tom said. It's different from the others. It's the one they follow, Eliza said. Even the ones that can see well enough to lead themselves? Even those, she said. They learn to follow that one first. Habit's a powerful thing. Tom was quiet for a moment. Then, could I buy a few? In the spring, if Pruitt has more? You could tell me what to do with them. She looked at him. You could come learn here, she said. Cheaper than buying your own and making the mistakes I already made. He smiled then, and she realized she hadn't seen Tom Alderley smile since before the beetle season started. And it changed his face entirely, made him look like someone were dark, made him look like someone younger than the person who'd been standing at his failing fence line watching her field stay green. All right, he said. Spring. He left, and she and Caleb closed the barn and walked back to the house in the late summer dark. And she was aware as they walked of the sounds of the farm around her, the pen, the barn, the creek, all the ordinary sounds that had been there every night, and that she'd been too occupied to simply hear for a long time. She heard them now. The bank meeting was on a Friday. She and Caleb drove to town in the wagon with the payment in the tin box that had, until recently, held the letter she didn't think about anymore. She wore her good dress, which was clean but which she'd last worn to a neighbor's wedding 2 years prior, and which now fit her somewhat differently across the shoulders, because the shoulders it was now fitting had spent a summer doing things. Shoulders did not do sitting at a wedding. The banker was a man named Gerald Fitch, who was 60. And wore a collar that was slightly too tight and who had the careful, most of its window expression of a man who dealt all day in other people's worst moments and had developed a professional distance from them that he maintained even in the good ones. He counted the payment. He counted it again. He looked up at her and Caleb with an expression that broke slightly from the professional distance, not much, just at the edges. This is the full note, he said. Plus the interest accumulated through end of month. Caleb said. I calculated it twice. Fitch looked at the payment again. Your field was one of the ones that he seemed to search for the right word. Survived. Yes, Eliza said. I've had 4 families in this office this week regarding their potato debts, he said. He said it without inflection. Just a statement of the arithmetic of the valley's season. It's been a difficult week. I imagine it has, Eliza said. He processed the payment and stamped the papers and slid them across the desk to Caleb, who signed where he was shown to sign, and that was that. A thing that had been over their heads since before the spring planting was no longer over their heads. The farm was theirs in a way it hadn't quite been when they'd driven into town that morning. She didn't cry. She'd been worried she might, which was why she'd thought about it ahead of time and decided she wouldn't. Not because there was anything wrong with it, but because she preferred to keep the significant feelings see for places where she could have them without an audience. She had them later, that evening, briefly and privately, sitting at the kitchen table with Caleb's hand over hers, and then that was done, and she felt better for it and moved on. September came. The valley settled into the particular mood of a hard season, ending the mixture of relief and grief that came from surviving something that had taken other things down with it. Several farms had lost enough of their crop that the winter would be genuinely difficult. 2 families had already been in to the bank about their situations, and one of them, the Weavers on the far north section, were selling 50 acres that Gerald Fitch would find a buyer for before the leaves turned. Eliza thought about the Weavers and felt the weight of that, the same weight she'd felt looking at Silas's diminished east field and at Tom Alderley, standing hatless at her pen and at the empty spaces in the barn where her neighbors' crates should have been stacked. Surviving was not uncomplicated when surviving meant that others hadn't. She held that honestly. She didn't let it become guilt, because guilt was a useless response to good management of a bad situation. But she didn't dismiss it either, because it was real, and it was part of the season, and pretending otherwise would have been a different kind of dishonesty. She sent food to the weavers, not with ceremony, and not with any words attached that would make it about her. Just food sent with Caleb left at the door. The teaching started in October, the way Silas had predicted. It started with Ruth, though by this point, Ruth's education at the Rourke farm was so established that it would have been strange to call it starting. What changed in October was that Vera Hollis came with her one morning, not to check on Ruth, or at least not only to check on Ruth, but with her sleeves already rolled up, and the look of a woman who had been watching something from a distance long enough that distance had stopped being comfortable. Vera was a quick learner, it turned out. She asked too many questions, not too many in terms of excess. Too many in the sense of more than Eliza was used to processing simultaneously, but they were good questions, specific and practical, the questions of someone who had been observing longer than she'd been willing to admit. By the second week of October, 3 neighboring farm women were coming on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. Eliza structured it the way she'd structured everything from the problem, not from theory. She showed them what she did and why she did it, not as a system to be memorized, but as a set of principles that each of them would adapt to their own situations in their own ways. She told them about the mistakes she'd made and what the mistakes had taught her, because that was at least as important as the things that had worked. She was not a natural teacher in the way that some people were, the way that came easily and warmly without requiring effort. It required effort. She was by nature a person who worked things out alone, who processed by observation and writing and the long private labor of her own mind, and opening that process to a room full of people asking questions while ducks milled around their ankles was something she had to learn the same way she'd learned everything else that summer, by doing it imperfectly and adjusting. But she did it, and she was better at it by the 4th week than she had been in the first. Ruth stayed. That was understood between them without being formally stated. Ruth came every morning through the fall, helping with the morning operation, taking on the training of 3 new birds Eliza had acquired from a farm 2 valleys over, becoming so competent with the flock management that Eliza could leave her in charge of the pen for a full morning and find everything exactly as it should be when she returned. One morning in late October, Eliza came back from an errand to town to find Ruth sitting in the pen with her back against the post, and Scout standing 3 inches from her knee, the same way he'd stood on the morning after the fox, and Ruth was talking to the bird in the low, practical voice she used when she thought nobody was listening. She was explaining the difference between first instar and second instar larvae to the duck. Eliza stood at the gate for a moment without interrupting. Then she said, "He already knows." Ruth looked up without embarrassment. "I know," she said. "I'm practicing for Thursday." Thursday was when the farm women came. Eliza unlatched the gate. "Make sure you explain why the second instar matters more than the first," she said. "That's the one they're going to ask about." "Because of the feeding rate," Ruth said. "Because of the feeding rate," Eliza confirmed. She went about her business, and Ruth went about, and Scout stood between them in the morning sun, with his bill tucked slightly toward his chest, listening to both of them with whatever constituted listening in a half-blind duck who had been following a whistle through potato rows all summer and had managed, in the process, to become the unlikely center of something that neither he nor anyone else had planned. Silas Varden came in November. Not to the pen this time, and not to the field. He knocked on the door, actually knocked, which she registered, and when she opened it, he had his hat in his hands again. And behind him on the road, she could see a wagon with 2 farmhands she recognized from his property. "I want to build a lane system," he said, "for next year. I want to do it right from the beginning, not as a response to a problem that's already started." She looked at him. "I'm going to need ducks," he said. "I don't know where to find ones that will work." "I can tell you where to look," she said, "and what to look for." "I'd be grateful," he said. She stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "I'll put coffee on." He came in. He sat at the same table where she'd sat in April with the paper and the pencil and the drawing of the corridors the morning after she'd found the first eggs. He wrapped his hands around a coffee cup, and she sat across from him, and they talked for an hour about ducks and beetles and soil, and the particular conditions of the valley, that made the beetle pressure heavier in some years than others. He listened. She talked. At some point, about 40 minutes in, she noticed that he was writing things down in a small book he'd pulled from his coat pocket, and she felt a complicated thing seeing that the small book, the writing, the careful noting of things he was learning. She knew something about that particular combination. When he left, she stood at the door and watched his wagon go down the road, and she thought about the morning she'd watched him walk away from her fence with his shoulders at that different angle, the first crack in his certainty. And she thought about where that had led and where she was standing now, and she didn't construct any large narrative out of it. She just noted it, the way she noted things plainly, honestly, in the book she kept for that purpose. The permanent pen was built before the first snow. Caleb spent 3 weeks on it, using timber rather than scrapboard, with proper wire and drainage and a covered section for the worst of the winter weather. It was not beautiful, it was a duck pen, and Caleb built it to be sound. Not decorative, but it was solid in a way that the original pen hadn't been. And the stress recovery section was twice the size of the original, because she'd learned things about how the birds needed that space that she hadn't known in April. The corridor system was rebuilt the same week, also from timber, also properly this time. Not the jury-rigged willow and barrel hoop arrangement that had served the summer, but a fixed structure that could be reconfigured for different row spacings, and that would last more than one season. She designed it herself, working from everything the summer had taught her about what the original designs had gotten wrong and right. And Caleb built to her specifications with the occasional creative modification that improved on her plan in ways she acknowledged without embarrassment. She was good at what she was good at. He was good at what he was good at. That was not a compromise. That was just the truth of how two people worked. On the first morning of real winter, the ground frozen, the sky that particular flat white that meant snow before afternoon, she walked the field. Not to check for beetles. There were no beetles in December. She walked it because it was hers, and she knew it, and she wanted to know it in winter the same way. She knew it, and every other season wanted the full accounting of the 40 acres at every point in the year. She went row by row slowly, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. The plants were gone now, the rows cleared and resting under a thin crust of frost. The corridor timbers ran between the rows, solid and square, waiting. In the pen, she could hear the ducks making their morning sounds. She stopped in the middle of the field. She looked north, toward the Varden property, where a new set of corridors would go in come spring. She looked east, toward what had been Tom Alderley's damaged section, now replanted with winter rye, that would restore the soil for next year's potatoes. She looked south, toward where the Weaver family had sold their 50 acres, which had been bought by a younger family who'd driven out from 3 counties away after hearing something she didn't know exactly what they'd heard, only that they'd heard something about a Briar Hollow farm that had survived a beetle year. She looked at what the summer had made, not a triumph. She was too honest with herself for that word, and too tired of the summer to romanticize it. What it had made was a working farm in a valley where some farms had not worked, and a knowledge she now carried that she hadn't carried before, and a girl who could explain larval in stars to a duck with the patient authority of someone who had genuinely learned something, and 61 birds who waddled through the cold morning air of their permanent pen, following a sound they had decided, somewhere in the middle of a terrifying summer, to trust. That was what it had made, and it was enough, more than enough. She turned up her collar against the cold and walked back to the house. She had coffee to make and correspondence to write 2 letters, one to a farmer in the next county who had sent questions through Tom Alderley, and one to a woman who'd heard about the lane system from Dorothy Crane and wanted to know if she could come in February to learn before her own spring planting. She would write both letters clearly and specifically without making herself larger than she was, and without making what she'd done sound simpler than it had been. She would tell the truth about what had worked and what hadn't and what it had cost, because that was the only kind of teaching that was worth anything. She would tell them about the corridors, which hadn't been the answer. She would tell them about the ducks, which had. She would tell them about Scout, who had led without knowing he was leading, and about Ruth, who had learned without being told she was learning, and about Caleb, who had chosen his wife over the valley's judgment on a morning when the gap between those two things had felt like a canyon. She would tell them that the valley had laughed, and she would tell them what had happened after the laughter. And she would tell them because it was true, because it was the thing the summer had written into her more deeply than anything else. More deeply, the beetle counts, and the beetle measurements, and the corridor measurements, and the price per bushel. She would tell them that the most useful thing she had ever done was refuse to let someone else's estimate of her become her estimate of herself. Not because she'd known she was right. She hadn't known. She'd been scared every day and wrong about several things. And the fox had nearly ended it, and there had been a morning in the mud within the corridor in pieces where she'd understood that failure was not a thing that happened to other people. But she had kept going, because scared and stopped were not the same thing, and because 63 animals had trusted a sound she made and followed it through the rows, and you didn't quit on something that had decided to follow you. You kept whistling. You kept moving, and sometimes, not always, not as often as the stories made it seem, but sometimes the thing everyone said was worthless turned out to be exactly what survival required. She went inside. She made the coffee. She sat down and began to write.